what's your understanding? What's your take on the current situation of the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, I think to understand what's going on the battlefield, we have to understand that the Russian approach to this war is not to conquer territories, but to destroy a potential. And I think is very important to note, because in the Western narrative, we tend to understand war as a way to acquire new territories. And you have this narrative of Russia trying to extend its territory, trying to recreate the Tsarist imperial Russia, or even the Soviet Union. This is nothing about that. We have to remember that on the 24th of February 2022, Vladimir Putin stated two objectives for the special military operation, and namely to demilitarize the threat to the population of Donbass. So not demilitarize the whole Ukraine, but just the threat to the population of Donbass, and to denazify this threat to the population of Donbass. So that were the two stated objectives at the beginning of the war. And you notice that both objectives refer to a potential, not to territory, not to some kind of power struggle or regime change or things like that. It's a pure potential issue. Now, we will discuss that probably later in the strategic approach of the Russia. But basically, what we have seen in the last 2 years is exactly that. And these objectives were achieved. The denazification was achieved on the 28th of March 2022, after the Mariupol was surrounded by Russian forces. And then the Russian military said, we have achieved this objective. And even the Financial Times titled that this objective of denazification will no longer be in the list of the objectives of the Russian, because it was achieved. The second objective, or maybe the first one in the importance, the demilitarization, was in fact achieved 3 times. The first time it was achieved in May, June 2022, as the then Ukrainian army was literally crushed, and Zelensky himself said at that point that Ukraine was depending on its Western allies for equipment and all that. So meaning that all the major equipment were destroyed, and from that point, Europe started to provide equipment. And you had a first batch of equipment that was provided to the Ukrainian army, and namely, basically old stocks of the ex-East European states, I mean, ex-stocks from the Soviet period, if you want. Old Soviet T-72, old aircraft and things like that. So that was outdated equipment that was supplied from May, June 2022 to, let's say, November, December 2022. That's the second Ukrainian army, if you want. And then the situation became critical again. And then the Western countries decided to provide Western equipment. And then we had the struggle to have Leopard 2 tanks and M1 Abrams and Challengers and all this kind of equipment that was provided between end of 2022 until spring 2023 for the so-called counteroffensive of the summer 2023. And this equipment has been more or less destroyed. And what we have now is a kind of a composite army based on what Ukraine had at the beginning of the special military operation in February 2022, and with mixed equipment coming from old Soviet storage, old storage from the European Union and NATO countries, and so on and so forth. So it's a patchwork. It's a type of patchworked army that we have now, and basically we can say that this demilitarization was achieved 3 times by the Russians, because today we see that the equipment part is become critical again for Zelensky, and that's a reason why he is struggling to get the funding from the US, funding from the EU, and the EU is struggling to find equipment, including artillery shells, that the French government stepped up military production in order to fulfill the requirement for both European countries and the Ukraine. So, in fact, Russia achieved these objectives, but there is still this the manpower. And in fact, what we have seen since October 2022, and that was stated by the Russian General Surovikin, who was the head of the Russian forces on the Ukrainian theater, and he said our strategy now is no longer to make big operation with big arrows on the map, but to grind down systematically, methodically, the Ukrainian army that proceeds. So the idea was leaving or letting the Ukrainian proceed and crushing them down as they proceed. And that was the approach, and that's still the approach. Now, the problem is that Ukrainians have no longer the ability to proceed and to move forward. Therefore, the Russians are slowly moving ahead. And again, the purpose of their advance that we see right now in Donbass, in Avdiivka region, and all these regions, I don't want to go into the details, but what we see now is the Russian, in fact, moving forward not to gain territory, but to destroy the forces that are in front of them. That's the whole issue on the battlefield. And I think it's very important. It should be very important for the West to understand that, because the help and the support we provide to the Ukrainians in moment is just, in fact, feeding the Russians. We are just feeding Russian objectives. And we make the Russian objectives achieved, in fact. That's what we make. Remember that in March, mid-March 2022, because Zelensky, I think, sensed that the situation was turning bad for Ukraine. And he engaged in in fact, 3, but we started with 2 initiatives to negotiate. The first round came on the 22nd of February 2022. And on that's one day after the beginning of the Russian offensive, by the way. And at that day, Zelensky called the Swiss foreign minister, asking for the organization of a peace conference. And this initiative was curtailed by the Western countries, European countries, the European Union, who said, no, there is no discussion. You will continue fighting. Here's a package of 450 million for weapons to continue fighting. And so this very first round of negotiation that started very much just a few days at the Belarusian border was cut, and then war continued. And mid-March 2022, Zelensky made a proposal to the Russians, and the Russians were happy with that proposal and started to get into negotiations. Were ready to sign the proposal, and this proposal was in substance that all Russian troops had to leave Ukraine in exchange of the neutralization of Ukraine under international supervision. That's, in a nutshell, the core aspect of this Zelensky proposal, meaning that the Russians had definitely no objectives to gain territory. They were ready to leave that territory in exchange of something. So we can see that what happens now, in fact, is probably for the Russians the same idea. They will ground down the Ukrainian forces up to the point where the Ukrainians will come up with a new plan, and with the difference that probably this time the Russian will say, okay, you refused the previous plan, so the question of leaving Ukraine is no longer on discussion, no longer on the table. So we will discuss from on the basis of the situation that is now on the ground. And that's, in a nutshell, the situation that we have now. But it's important to understand that the Russians are not aiming at gaining territory, but at destroying the Ukrainian potential. So the more we feed that potential, the more we facilitate, in fact, the work of the Russians. And in addition to that, in fact, the West is depleting its own potential. So in fact, by reaching the objective of depleting the Ukrainian potential, by the same token, Russia is depleting the Western potential. And that's exactly the issue we have now in Europe, trying to struggle with the military industrial complex to cope with the situation in Ukraine.
When it comes to the casualties on the part of Ukrainians and Russians, what's your estimation?
Well, as you know, the Ukrainian government doesn't communicate on that, and probably with good reasons. There were some indications that I reported in my books last year, that was late summer 2023. Ukrainian journalists published on his Twitter account or Telegram account, I don't remember, but he published the figure of at least 310,000 fatalities. So we have here to make a difference between casualties, because casualties comprises both fatalities and other losses, like wounded personnel and deserting personnel and things like that, and also people who have missing in action, in fact. So casualties is a broader term. But if we go to the more strict term of fatalities, this journalist, Ukrainian journalist, I have to emphasize this. This Ukrainian journalist mentioned 310,000 fatalities. And there was also late last year a phone company in Ukraine decided to pay tribute to all the people who died on the battlefield in Ukraine. That's a Ukrainian phone company. And they decided to publish one message for each person who died on the battlefield. And the number of message that was totaling at the end was 400,000. So 400,000 people that died. So there is no way to confirm these figures, and probably nobody in the West is in a position to confirm or to disprove these figures. But we have to, if we go from another way, we know that the Russian casualties are probably around 50,000 fatalities. Sorry, the number of fatalities, Russian fatalities, are probably around 50,000 people. And this figure comes from an opposition website. It's Mediazona. And they started at the beginning of the Russian military operation to work with the British BBC to assess the number of fatalities based on what you can see on the social networks and in the Russian press, like obituaries and things like that. As a result, they have an estimate, which is probably not an exact figure, but it's an estimate that at least based on something. Let's say there is a rationale behind this, and I use these figures. I don't know how precise they are, but the methodology seems to me at least more, let's say, relevant than the guesstimate that we have in the Western media. So assuming that the Russians have around 50,000 fatalities, assuming that most of the fatalities on the battlefield are generated by artillery fire, and assuming that especially in the 2 first years of the special military operation, the Russians had a superiority from 10 to 1 in artillery fire in terms of number of shells shot. We can assume, and again, it's an assumption, that the fatalities ratio between Russians and Ukrainians is 1 to 10. So that means that if we have 50,000 fatalities on the Russian side, we may probably have something around 400 to 500,000 fatalities in Ukraine. This figure seems to be confirmed by some individuals that tried to make a count based on the size of the cemeteries in Ukraine. And I have no idea of how serious this work has been done. I know that there was, on the Ukrainian side, there was some individuals trying to do the same work as Mediazona does for the Ukrainian side, and they came also to a figure that is around more than 400,000 fatalities. So I don't know what the exact figure is, but if we look at the report from the Russian military, the Russian Ministry of Defense, which, by the way, of course, it's a party to the war, so we can assume that they have a biased view on all that, and a biased reporting as well. By the way, I've been in some crisis areas with the UN, and I notice it's extremely difficult to assess battle casualties because because of the fog of war, if you want, and that it becomes very difficult to have precise figures on these kind of things. But anyway, if we consider that, I try to compare ex post, that mean weeks after the Russian Ministry of Defense made its announcement and announced figures. If we made the comparison, let's say 1 month later, we see that the Russians' figures were rather precise. So I tend to trust what the Russians say, not based on my faith and because I am pro X or Z, but based on the comparison with the figures we can have from Mediazona and from other sources, and probably the Russians are quite right on that. So we have definitely an imbalance in terms of the casualties slash fatalities between Russia and Ukraine in that conflict. And that's what we see today. By the way, we see that it has become a critical issue for Ukraine. And if you add to the amount of casualties the fact that a lot of Ukrainian soldiers defect, there's a lot of deserters. By the way, in the in 2014, I used to work for the NATO. I mean, I was working for the NATO, within the NATO between 2012 and 2017, roughly. And I was in charge of the fight against proliferation of small arms. And because of this task, if you want, I had to monitor the situation in Ukraine, and I used to go there also for NATO. But at that time, we noticed that there were a huge number of Ukrainian soldiers who defected. At that time, it was mostly Russian-speaking soldiers who defected to the rebels. And that's what happened, for instance, in Crimea in February 2022, where you had, as a total, you had 22,000 Ukrainian soldiers stationed in Crimea. And after this started uprising from the Russian-speaking population, 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers left. That means 90%, more than 90% of the Ukrainian soldiers defected to the rebels and to the Ukrainian speaking, because they were Ukrainian speaking themselves. So they didn't want to shoot at their brothers, and therefore they defected. That's the same happened in the Donbass, where you had full regiments that defected to the rebels, including ammunition and tanks and armored vehicles, and you name it. They got all their equipment and defected. The whole unit defected, not individual soldiers. So this is something that affected the Ukrainian army since the beginning of this war in 2014. And during the special military operation, this number had ups and downs. And today we see more and more Ukrainian soldiers who defect or probably just leave the theater. They probably not necessarily defect to the Russians, but they just leave the territory. And this was a source of concern, because end of last year, beginning of this year, the Ukrainian government asked the European Union countries to help and to assist in repatriating individuals who were capable of being recruited in the Ukrainian army. And if I look around here in Brussels, where I am, I can see that you have a lot of young Ukrainians who are very young, I mean, in their late 20s or 30s, who could be able to fight, but they prefer having big SUVs and the Mercedes here in Brussels than going on a battlefield in Ukraine. So this problem adds to the issue of the manpower that Ukraine lost. They lost physically individuals, but in addition to that, they lost also the confidence of the young Ukrainians. And you have more and more individuals in Ukraine who resist conscription, try to defect. You have a lot of issue regarding corruption, because basically it was known that you can pay, and you just have to pay the border guards with $5,000 or something like that to leave the country, and being so de facto exempted from war. So this is the situation. So this has become a critical resources for the Ukrainians. And that explains also the reason why you have no European countries thinking about sending troops. So you have this paradox situation that you have European countries or European soldiers go to fight a war that the Ukrainians themselves don't want to fight. And that's even in my first book on the Ukraine conflict, Operation Z, I mentioned a poll that was made by the Kiev Institute for the Kiev International Institute for of Sociology, the Kiev International Institute of Sociology. And they made a poll about the willingness to defend the country. They made this poll, they made two of them, one in December 2021 and one in February 2022. And what you see out of this poll is that basically you had at that time in February 2022, only 16%, 16% of the population that was ready to resist the Russians with arms. You had a lot of other people who were ready to resist in kind of civil or let's say kind of civilian resistance, if you want, so unarmed resistance. So you had quite a lot of population, probably 30 to 40%, who were ready to do some kind of civilian unarmed resistance, but ready to go fight the Russians with arms. You had something like 16%. And that's a national average. If you go in areas like the east of the country, where you have the Donbass, by the way, and in the southern part of the country, where you have a lot of Russian-speaking country, then this in the east, if I think the figures, if I remember well, was around 5% of the population was ready to fight with arms. And in the south of the country, I mean, all the region that is currently occupied by Russia, by the way, in this area, you had barely 11% of the population who was ready to fight the Russians. Now, in February 22, all these people who were ready to fight have left. They have moved to the western part of Ukraine. Most have left the country at large. As a result, you have in these parts, in the east and southern part of Ukraine, only people who don't want to fight. And in the rest of the country, you have probably something like 20% of the population was ready to fight with arms against the Russians. And another thing that you have to take into consideration that the Western countries or the Western media never mention is that you have active resistance, military resistance in the Western part of the country, meaning that you have activities of sabotage, partisan warfare, in fact, guerrilla, in fact, in the western part of the country, which is basically Russian guerrilla, if you want. So people, Russian speaking or people who are in favor of Russia, who fight within the western part of the Ukraine. So the situation in terms of the willingness to fight the Russian is extremely dire in Ukraine.
If we assume that one of the main goals of this conflict, this war in Ukraine, was to weaken the Russian army, in your opinion, is Russian army weakening or has weakened during this conflict, this war in Ukraine?
Well, I think the objective of this war was to, in fact, provoke a regime change. It was to weaken Russia at large and to provoke a regime change. So it was not really directed at the Russian army as such, but it was directed at Russia. And we know that because this was stated in a document that was published in spring 2019, a document that was written by the Rand Corporation, and that established a strategy to weaken Russia. And what we have seen in the last 2 years, from February 22 up to now, is in fact all the headings of that strategy being unfolded. In fact, that's what we have seen. I mean, it's striking. If you go through that strategy, you see all the different aspects of the strategy being methodically applied in this conflict. So the idea was that Russia had to be dragged into a conflict that would then be supplemented. I mean, the 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 idea of having a conflict with Russia was then to allow to apply massive sanctions against Russia. And in fact, the core aspect of this war was or were the sanctions. That was the core dimension of the conflict. And this was also explained, by the way, also in March 2019 by a close advisor to Zelensky, Alexei Arestovich, and he explained in an interview he gave to an Ukrainian channel, the Ukrainian channel is Apostrophe, and in that interview, he explains that the idea of weakening Russia was had the objectives of allowing Ukraine to join NATO. The rationale was that Ukraine could not join NATO as long as they have a conflict with Russia because of, I don't know if you are familiar with the NATO treaty or the so-called Washington Treaty that was signed on the 4th of April 1949 in Washington. And in that treaty, it is stated in its Article 5 that if a country, a member of the alliance, is attacked or is at war, then all the others have to assist this country. It's not said how they should assist, but they should assist this country to solve this problem and to repel the aggressor. This was obviously made with the Soviet Union in mind, and with the assumption that the Soviet Union was ready to attack Western Europe. And but the problem of this article is that if you have a country that has already a conflict, then that means that the probability of launching Article 5 is very high. For that reason, and Zelensky himself said to CNN in 2022, he confessed that NATO, in fact, was in principle agreed to have Ukraine, but he will not accept that because the situation doesn't allow Ukraine to be part of NATO. So it was necessary to weaken Russia to the point that Russia was no longer a possible not only aggressor, but party to a conflict. That was the idea, to make Russia so weak that it could not be a party to a war. That was the idea. And Alexei Arestovich explains that in plain words, and very candidly. He explained that Ukraine had to provoke that war. And that's exactly, by the way, what the Rand Corporation report said exactly at the same time. And that's exactly what we have seen. And you have to remember that the OSCE observers noted by mid-February 2022 an increase of the shelling of the Donbass by the Ukrainian forces. And why you had this shelling? Because Zelensky issued a decree on the 24th of March 2021. He issued a decree for the reconquest of Crimea and the southern part of the country. The title of the decree mentioned only Crimea, but when you read the decree, you see that this decree affects equally the rest of the country, meaning that and that from that point, I mean, the decree was signed on the 24th of March, and from early April 2021, you had this buildup of forces in the Donbass area by the Ukrainian forces, and you had, as a reciprocity, if you want, the Russians building up their forces at the Ukrainian borders. So you had the whole situation started at this point. And this was the idea to push Russia in a war, and by having Russia intervening in the Donbass, as Russia had done in Georgia, by the way. So it's exactly the same scenario that was played in the Donbass. By having Russia attacking in the Donbass, this would allow those sanctions to weaken Russia. And that was stated very bluntly by the French Minister of Economy, Bruno Le Maire, in early March 2022. He said on a very famous Europe numéro 1, which is one of the major radio broadcast in France. He said, our aim is to crush, to make Russia to collapse. And we will provoke the collapse of Russia, and the Russian population will suffer. So that's what he said. And we had exactly that. The problem is that the basis of this strategy was that Russia was extremely weak to start with. And at that time, in the European media, people was mentioning that Russia had an economy that was weaker than the one of Italy or Spain, which are basically two economies in Europe that are affected by a huge debt, a foreign debt, and are basically extremely fragile economies. And the media and even experts in the West tended to compare the Russian economy to the one of Italy and Spain. As a result, we underestimated the capacity of the Russian economy. And as a result, when the sanctions were applied, well, they didn't work that as expected, because since 2014, as the first sanctions were applied to Russia after the Maidan and all that, Russia started to, let's say, reinforce its own economy and made its economy independent from the West. Namely, typically, I mentioned the foreign debt. If you look at the foreign debt of Russia in February 2022, you can see that Russia had one of the lowest foreign debts in the whole OECD countries. And that means, in other words, that the Russian economy was not vulnerable to external pressure. It was not really an autarky, but basically we were very close to that point. And at the same time, Russia developed also relationships with China and other countries. And so when all these sanctions were applied to Russia in February, March 2022, in fact, they didn't affect the Russian economy at all, because the Russian economy had already alternative solutions. And in fact, the calculus of the Europeans were that if the economy would collapse, then the political system would collapse, and the population would then turn over the government, and probably to topple the government and to change the regime. Because there's another false assumption or misguided assumption in the West, is that Putin is hated by its own population. And in fact, there were figures showing that Putin, even before the special military operation was very popular in Russia. And after the beginning of the military operation, the popularity of Vladimir Putin even increased. In fact, before the special military operation, the the popularity rate of Putin was around 65%. And after the beginning of the special military operation, it went up to 80%. And during the whole special military operation, this rate was maintained, and today it's about 85%. So I think no Western politician and leader has the same popularity, and that was everybody in the West was saying that they were propaganda figures and they didn't match the reality and all that. The figures, and they are mentioned in my books, by the way, these are the figures that I take from the Levada Center. The Levada Center is a Paul Institute in Moscow, which is funded or partially funded by the Americans. Therefore, it's considered as a foreign agent in Russia. And and in fact, if we see the figures provided by the Levada Center, by the way, we have seen that Vladimir Putin was re-elected with about by 87% of the population. Of course, you can say, well, that's probably propaganda and things like that. But in fact, it matches the figures that were provided throughout the special military operation by the Levada Center. The Levada Center makes every month a survey about the popularity of all the politicians and the popularity of the government as a whole, and also make a survey about how the population accepts or supports the military operation as such. And if we see the figures that are provided by the Levada Center, we see that they're extremely consistent since the beginning of the military operation. And we see that they're consistent now with the figures we have seen in the presidential election. So I'm not saying that the presidential election have been flawless. I don't know. I was not there. So maybe there was some problems. I can accept that. I have no idea. But if we look at the results, we see that the figures obtained, the score obtained by Putin matches closely what the popularity rate of Vladimir Putin during those 2 years. So it seems rather consistent to me. So meaning that, in fact, the West underestimated the popularity of Vladimir Putin. And it's the same thing that we are witnessing now with those terrorist attacks that are waged by Ukraine and whoever supports Ukraine, to say it diplomatically. But the thing is that in Russia, we have also to understand that even in 2014, the Russian population didn't understand why Putin didn't intervene in Ukraine. The Russian population was asking Vladimir Putin to intervene, in fact. And Vladimir Putin resisted that because he didn't want to have a problem with, to engage into a military war, probably also because Russia at this very point, was not ready for this kind of military operation. Because Russia, as the other countries in Europe, we have to remember that after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and in the subsequent years, the priorities in Europe at large, the priority was at the economics and the reconstruction of countries and not at making war. As a result, even European countries had basically their military-industrial complex falling apart. And the same happened in Russia as well, because for Russia was no point to, there was not the idea of waging a war against Europe at all. So Vladimir Putin, because he felt a threat from the West, started to rebuild its military apparatus, so to say. And in 2014, it was certainly not ready to wage a war against Ukraine. And for that reason, Vladimir Putin resisted this idea. And between 2014 or 2015, should I say, as the Minsk agreement was signed in February 2015, so from that point, Vladimir Putin counted on the Minsk agreement to solve the problem. So he looked for a diplomatic solution. And here we can see also a different approach, because Vladimir Putin definitely, and this is totally documented, there's no propaganda in that, this was documented, Vladimir Putin strived to have a diplomatic solution, namely the implementation of the Minsk agreement, which, by the way, was also a resolution of the UN Security Council, meaning that the Minsk II, because you had two Minsk agreements, you had one signed in September 2014 and a second in February 2015. This second Minsk agreement became a resolution. I don't have the number right now in my head, but this became a UN Security Council resolution. And therefore, the Minsk agreement became international law at this point, and became also binding, legally and politically binding, by the simple fact that it was a UN Security Council resolution. And therefore, Vladimir Putin strived to have the implementation of that resolution. But on the Western side, the Minsk agreement was signed, as you probably know, by the Kiev government and by the government of the two Donbas republics. And on the Donbas side, the guarantor was Russia. And on the Kiev side, there are two guarantors, and namely France and Germany. But we know today, because François Hollande, who used to be president at that time, and Angela Merkel, who was the German chancellor at the time of the Minsk agreement, both confessed that they never had in mind the implementation of the Minsk agreement, that this agreement was basically only there to buy time in order to allow Ukrainian forces to be rebuilt and ready for war against Russia. So that means that you had a kind of dissymmetry in the approach to this, the issue of Donbass. On one side, on the Russian side, you had this idea that the problem should be solved by diplomatic and political means. And on the Western side, they decided, the idea was that this should be solved by military means, which is exactly what led to the situation that we had that led, in fact, to the decree of Zelensky on the 24th of March 2021, and that in turn led to what we witnessed, or the OSCE observed from mid-February 2022, namely the increase of artillery fire against Donbass and the increased Ukrainian preparedness to attack the Donbass. And that event, or that fact, in fact, prompted the Russians to decide to intervene. And in order to intervene, the Russians decided to recognize the independence of the two Republic of Donbass. And why did they do that? Because by considering the two Donbas republics as independent, they could sign, they could allow the parliaments of both republics to ask for assistance to Russia and sign an agreement, a treaty of military assistance and friendship with Russia. And that's exactly what happened. You had the signature as soon as the two republics were declared independent by Russia. Those two republics signed an agreement of friendship and military assistance with Russia. And then the parliament of the two republics asked for military assistance to Russia, and Russia could intervene in the framework of Article 51 of the UN Charter that allows to a regional coalition to prevent an aggression from another state, and namely the aggression of Ukraine against the two Republic of Donbass. And that's exactly what happened in those 2 or 4 days between the 20th of February and the 24th of February. That's the mechanics. And so Russia could intervene as it did in Georgia in 2008, basically under the label, if you want, or the principle, the UN principle of the responsibility to protect, which is a principle that has been accepted by the UN, which allows countries to take measures in the case a population is threatened by a military aggression or similar action. And that's exactly what Russia did in 2008, and that's exactly what it did in 2022 in the Donbass. So there's a consistent approach, and basically that explains, in fact, the methodology of the Russians to intervene. But it's clear to me, and I think many international observers who have observed all these different aspects, because if you look at the media and even the European or Western leadership at large, this leadership tends to avoid the questions of the decree of Zelensky, and I didn't mention all of them because you had, in addition to that, you had this decree. No, not the decree of Zelensky. It's wrong. It's a law that was passed by the Ukrainian parliament on the 1st of July 2021 that gives different rights to the population of Ukraine depending on the ethnicity. So this is basically exactly the same kind of law that you may have had in South Africa in the or in Germany. Some have compared that to the so-called Nuremberg laws of 1935 that gave different rights to the citizens depending on their ethnicity. And if you were a pure German, you had different rights as the one who were not pure Germans, and so on and so forth. So you had exactly the same aspect. It was in Ukraine, this was not exactly the same as on the Nuremberg law. It's not so harsh, but still, and I mention very often this lawmaker of the party of Zelensky, who said on the 2nd of July, and that was in the Ukrainian press, by the way, so no invention of me. He said that from that point, the Russians will no longer have all the rights that are in the Ukrainian constitutions, and they will not be entitled to all the human rights. So when you add up all these elements that the media tend to forget, you come to the conclusion that there were no much choice for Russia as to intervene. I'm not sure, again, that it was the best solution, but there was good reason for the Russians to intervene. And I think if we deny this, I think it would be a mistake, because all these aspects play a role in the whole equation of this conflict. So in a nutshell, that's how the Russians understand the approach to this war.
How this war in Ukraine changed the Russian army, and how do you see the current state of the Russian army?
Well, the thing is that the Russian army, first of all, is an army that has a very consistent doctrinal backbone. This is the Russian army was designed to fight, to defend the Russians. Let's put it that way. If you compare that to Western armies, they were probably designed that way during the Cold War. But after the Cold War, Western armies were redesigned to fight, I could almost say, colonial wars, in fact, that you had in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and all that. And that affected the equipment of these armies. I mean, the type of equipment you need in a war in Iraq or Afghanistan, which is close to a counterinsurgency war. You need a completely different type of equipment than in a conventional war as you have in Ukraine, for instance. So that's the first aspect. But the second aspect, probably more importantly, the most significant aspect is that it broke the doctrinal continuum of the Western armies. The Western armies were built after the Second World War with the defense of the European continent in mind. And therefore, you had the buildup of conventional armies organized like conventional forces with division, battalions, whatever, and tanks, and I mean, everything you can imagine as a conventional army. But fighting in Iraq required a totally different doctrinal mechanism and apparatus and system, if you want. And the Russian army has never had this kind of dilemma. It had it probably as it was fighting the war in Afghanistan, but Afghanistan is long ago, if you want. Since the end of the Cold War, the Russians continued to elaborate their doctrinal system, I would say, into a consistent system. They integrated technological advance and all that to improve the integration of intelligence, for instance, into decision making and so on and so forth. So, meaning that what the Russian had needed was an impulse to boost the implementation of this doctrine into new equipment and to boost, if you want, the military-industrial complex, if I can put it simply. And this war in Ukraine gave, in fact, Russia the opportunity to rebuild or to reshuffle its military-industrial complex. But importantly, as I said, they had not to reconstruct the doctrinal aspect. So even if you compare even the doctrinal system of the Russians today with the one they had in the Soviet Union, would say that it's very similar. If you remove the Marxist dimension that you had in the Soviet Union, you have exactly the same doctrinal architecture. As a result, the Russians could, in fact, use the same, let's say, rationale, the same intellectual approach to the war as they had during the Cold War. And that's exactly what you see now. That's why I think, even if assuming Europe would engage Russia physically on the battlefield by sending battalions or brigades or whatever. I think the West would have a hard time against the Russian because they had this continuum in the doctrinal thinking, doctrinal architecture that gave them a very robust doctrinal approach to the conflict. And what we can see on the battlefield in Ukraine is a Russian military that has improved because it had to be, after all, it had not fought a war since the Cold War. I mean, before the Cold War, in fact. So it had to relearn a lot of things. But the learning curve is probably easier to manage than the learning curve in the West if we would do the same. And this is why you have a very robust army that has improved. If the West would engage the Russians, it would have to go through a kind of revolutionary process to adjust to the Ukrainian battlefield, while the Russians have just to face an evolutionary process. And that's exactly what you have seen in the last 2 years. They improved their equipment. They improved the integration of their equipment. They didn't change radically their equipment, but they improved the integration of them. They made, in fact, what you can see in the Russian army today is a very sophisticated and consistent and coherent machinery that works. I mean, it has its own flaws as any machinery, and war is never certain. I mean, it's not because you have the best equipment that you are certain of winning. But at the same time, they don't have to struggle to adjust their system. The system is in an evolutionary process, while the Ukrainians on the other side, that were trained in the last 10 years, I would say, they were trained by NATO, by officers who had no experience of a conventional battlefield. And it's interesting because we see, I mean, the feedback of Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian officers who have been trained in the West in the last 2 years, because in order to use the Leopards 2 tanks and the Challengers and all that, the Ukrainians were sent to the West in Western armies to perfect their tactics and things like that. But when they came back in Ukraine, it's interesting to see that they confessed that they were disappointed by the level of the NATO officers who didn't understand the nature of the war which is fought in Ukraine. And I was amazed to see, and that was reported by the Washington Post, by the way. That was also reported in the Ukrainian press, by the way. But I was amazed to see that Ukrainian soldiers complained that the Western officers didn't prepare them for the war they were fighting in Ukraine. They said they don't know the war we are waging in Ukraine. So we have here a very strong discrepancy in the doctrinal the doctrinal approach to this conflict, and that gives the Russians a significant advantage. Now we have also to see that if you look at the military equipment of the Russians, also there you see an evolution. I mean, basically, they still have the Kalashnikov that was created in 1947, and it was, of course, improved with the time. And what you have today, what the Russian soldier has today, is basically an improved version of this Kalashnikov. It works the same way. This reliability has been improved. Its ability to accommodate different type of sites and things like that. It has been adjusted to the modern battlefield, but in essence, this is the same equipment. If you look at the tanks, it's the same thing. Basically, when you look at a T-90, it has very strong resemblance with a T-72. It is basically, you have an evolution in the system. A lot of components are modular, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. You just have to adjust a few things, and you can replace very easily one piece with another. So the whole system, and they're still using, by the way, artillery pieces that were designed in the Cold War. They simply adjusted the fire control system, because at the end of the day, the trajectory of a projectiles will always be the same. Basically, ballistics has not changed, but what you can improve is the accuracy of the projectile. So you have to improve the projectile, and you have to improve the fire control system. And when you have a precise or accurate fire control system, what you just have to adjust is the reconnaissance, so that you can identify a target very quickly and transmit it to the fire control system so that you can fire. But the cannon or the howitzer itself doesn't need to be changed, in fact. And you see, this is an evolutionary process that you have in the Russian army that makes it extremely robust, as opposed to the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainian side started the war, as I said, with old Russian equipment, in fact, because the Ukrainian army was basically equipped with Russian equipment. Then they had to adjust to other kind of equipment, things about artillery. They rapidly exhausted their own ammunition of 152 millimeters. And then they received howitzers and artillery pieces from the West, which have a 155 millimeter caliber, meaning that you can no longer use your old Soviet weapons, but you have to adjust to a new system with new logistics, with new which were designed in a different manner. I mean, the French Caesar was not designed for the same purpose as the two S7 on the Russian side, because the Caesar system was designed for, let's say, to simplify, was designed for what the West or the Americans call sniping artillery. So you fire not many shots, but very precisely. But for that, you need to have a very good integrated target acquisition system and very good integrated fire control system. The problem is that the Ukrainians had to adjust systems coming from different countries and try to husband these different system and to marry them, if you want. While for the Russians, they had never had this problem. The integration, the operational integration of the weapon system was not an issue with the Russians, basically, while it is a consistent problem with the Ukrainians. As a result, you have, on the Russian side, you have a very consistent and coherent machinery. And on the Ukrainian side, and I would dare to say even the Western side, if we would be engaged or committed to this battle, the Ukrainian battlefield, even Western armies would have a hard time to adjust and to have a coherent approach to fighting the Russians. And in addition to that, when talking about the doctrinal aspects, when you go deeper into that, the Russians, as I said, have a consistent doctrinal approach to the conflict. They also have a consistent and their equipment is tailored for this doctrine, meaning that if the Russians would start to have big mobile offensive operation, as they did in the very early phase of the special military operation in the northern part of Ukraine. I mean, big arrow operation, if you want. They have both the doctrine and the equipment to do so. While the West is no longer equipped for that, because when they were fighting in Iraq or in Afghanistan, basically they were rather static, and they were fighting a static war against insurgent. And you had only some special operation troops moving around, but you had no consistent operational activities as such. By the way, if you look at the Western doctrine, you would say that the operational art is almost forgotten. You have tactics and you have strategy, but the operational art is almost forgotten. While if you look at the Russian doctrine, operational art is the centerpiece of the doctrinal approach to war. And that gives the Russians a more robust capability to approach a war like as you would have in a conventional war in Europe or Eastern Europe, as it is the case in Ukraine. So we have a totally different approach to the war that explains why the Russians are in fact more effective, and explains also why the Russians probably without any surprise would fight a war with less fatalities and casualties than the Ukrainians. And that's in the nature of the conflict that was started. And I think the problem with the Ukrainians is that they were probably misled by the West and the Western advisors that were in Ukraine at the time. And I know because I have been after 2014, I was also involved as member of NATO. I was involved in Ukraine as well. And I can say that the people who NATO sent there was in the framework of the Partnership for Peace, because Ukraine was not member of NATO, but member of a Partnership for Peace, which also deal with training and this kind of thing. So there was a training provided by NATO to Ukrainian forces under the hat of the Partnership for Peace. But we can see that these the training we provided was not really tailored for this kind of conflict. So I could myself witness that. So that's in a nutshell, that's explained that the Russian military is in fact made for the type of war Russia is waging. The tanks are suited for this kind of terrain. I explained in my last book, for instance, that if you compare the height, just the height of a tank, you could see that the Leopard 2, and myself, I used to be commander of a Leopard 2 battalion. It's a fantastic machine. It's a fantastic tank with huge performance and all that. But it is made to be used in a terrain which is the Central Europe terrain, which is slightly hilly, with slightly hills. So the tank itself is very high in order to cope with the terrain. Look at the T-90, for instance. The Russian T-90 is extremely low on the ground. Why? Because it's designed to fight on this low terrain that you find in Ukraine and the eastern part of Russia. And therefore, it's much more difficult for a Ukrainian tank commander to detect a T-90 than it is for the commander of a T-90 to detect a Leopard 2 tank. If the Russians would use T-90 in Switzerland, in my country, then they would have a hard time, because their tanks is not designed for the type of terrain we have in Central Europe. But using tanks that are designed for Central Europe in Eastern Europe is a disadvantage. So you have all these kind of details that make the difference between what Ukraine has and what Russia has. By the way, a lot of equipment that has been provided to Ukraine in the second half of 2022 and in the first half of 2023, sorry, are equipment that were designed to fight in Iraq or in Afghanistan. And if you can see those vehicles like MRAP, for instance, these armored fighting vehicles that are wheeled and very high on the ground, because in a counterinsurgency, the important is that you need to be very high above ground to detect a possible ambush and things like this. So you need to be very high on the ground. I remember when I was in the late 80s in with the South African Army in Angola. They had those very high vehicles. They were very high on the ground. They were mine-proof, by the way, so they had a V-shape chassis underneath to protect against landmines, and they were very high on the ground, so they could detect what they used to call terrorists at the time, because these terrorists were hiding in the high grass. So you need a total different type of vehicles, and that's exactly the West has provided these kind of vehicles to the Ukrainians. But as I said before, if you look at the terrain in Ukraine, it's extremely flat, so you don't need to have a very high vehicle. A high vehicle will be detected there very quickly and will be destroyed equally quickly. So these, in fact, we didn't try to, that probably goes back to the question, to your previous question. We didn't try to help Ukraine. We tried to weaken and defeat Russia. And therefore, we didn't pay much attention to what we delivered to the Ukrainians. We didn't give them the equipment that would give them victory. We just give them equipment that would keep Russians busy on the battlefield. Basically, that's what we did. So there was no real, in fact, we didn't make any, let's say, honest effort to help the Ukrainians to win. So you can come now with additional equipment, additional ammunition, additional all that. The problem is that what we provided to Ukrainians will not allow to have victory. And everything we are doing now is to allow the Russians to pursue their initial objective, which is to demilitarize Ukraine. And I said at the beginning that the purpose, the stated objective was demilitarize the threat against Donbass. But again, here we have also to think how the Russians understand war. They understand war as Clausewitz did. That means that when you reach an objective, the objective you reach, let's say an operational objective, allows you open the door to a strategic objective. And if you reach a strategic objective, that opens the door to a political objective. That's why you used to say that the war is a continuation of politics with other means, because there's a continuum between military and politics. And for that reason, if you think about how the Russians approach this war, they reached the operational objective to discard or to demilitarize the threats, the threat to Donbass population. But now they understand after March 2022, that it will no longer possible. I mean, the West will not allow Ukraine to achieve or to go into a negotiation to find a political settlement to this conflict. So the Russians continue methodically. So they switch to demilitarizing the threat to Donbass to demilitarizing Ukraine. They will go like this. And when they say demilitarizing Ukraine, if we continue that way, that will translate into destroy Ukraine. So what we are making now, since in fact March 2022, is to push Ukraine into a black hole, in fact. And the Russians will continue methodically, and you have seen that they have stepped up their approach. I mean, they started to destroy now the critical infrastructure, what they have not done before. I mean, if you look carefully at what the Russians have done in late 2022, they have destroyed the electricity distribution centers, which is something that you can replace quite easily. But the problem is that the Ukrainians had to use their anti-aircraft system to protect these distribution centers. And the idea of the Russians, by attacking those distribution centers, was to deplete the anti-aircraft capabilities of Ukraine. And that was achieved. And now you see that the Ukrainians are in fact struggling to find anti-aircraft missiles because they have no longer this capability. And now what you see recently, you have seen the Russians attacking no longer distribution centers, but production center of electricity, because now they start to destroy Ukraine. And since the West has said there will be no negotiation with Russia, and we will continue to provide weapons. We even contemplate the idea of sending troops. So the Russians go a step further. They'll say, okay, so now that means that for us, we just have to make Ukraine inexistent. And they started to destroy the electricity production capabilities. You have seen the population of Kharkov moving westwards because they are leaving. So meaning that the second largest city of Ukraine is beginning to be emptied. And that means that slowly Ukraine will be restricted to a very small western part, in fact. And the Russians will continue that. The problem is that the West is still in this narrative that Russia is losing, that Russia is incapable of conducting army, that they are losing tanks, they are losing. If you look at the statistic, I don't know how it is in Brazil, but if you look at the Western media, it's you have just the impression that there is no Russian army anymore. But the opposite is true. And when you have, we are back to the question of fatalities, because you may remember that recently Zelensky said that there was only 31,000 fatalities in Ukraine. I think any reasonable expert said that that is just impossible. I mean, this is basically what they have lost in the recent months, but this is absolutely not the reality. So we tend to be, let's say, we start to, how to say that, to believe in our own narrative, and there is we tend to deny the reality simply, and therefore we are pressing Ukraine to fight in a fight that will lead absolutely nowhere. And you know, I have written several books in about the Ukraine war. This is the one which is behind me here is the Russian Art of War, is the latest.
By the
It's
way, I'm gonna put the link to your books in the description of this video.
Okay, thank you very much. But that's the fourth book that I have I've written. And because I've written these books, and basically I noticed that today Ukrainian generals say what I used to say in my first book, you see. So this is very, very strange, because the West doesn't want to acknowledge the reality, and even tends to say, if you are in a different opinion, then you are, of course, a support of Vladimir Putin and all that. But the reality is that because we didn't want to accept the very factual reality on the ground, we have led Ukraine on the wrong way. And as a result, we will have, and what we are witnessing now, and that's the reason why the West is panicking, by the way, because we see that, in fact, we pushed Ukraine towards a blatant defeat. And again, this is something which is totally irrational. And I myself, but I have a military background, and the military, the characteristics of the military is that they tend to make their judgment based on the reality, because for us, the reality of the battlefield, it's not theory. When you have the enemy in front of you, this is a real enemy, and you have to fight a real enemy. And for that reason, we tend to assess the situation as it is. And in addition to that, I have a background in intelligence. In intelligence, you're not trying to make politics. In intelligence, you try to present to the decision maker. And for me, the people I was advising were, in fact, the defense minister. So when you go to this person and you say that's the situation, you're not trying to make politics. You are just trying to make the situation and to present the situation as factually, as honestly, as objectively as it is. He's the politician. He has to make decision. But you, as an intelligence and military officer, it's not your task try to distort information in order to influence a decision. You have to make an assessment that opens the different doors for him to take his own decision. You're not making the decision for him. And that's exactly the way I designed my books. By the way, if you read my books, you will see that a lot of sources are in fact coming from Ukrainians themselves, in fact, because the Ukrainians themselves have already warned that they were misled. And I'm not talking about the official propaganda, because the official propaganda is what the Western media tends to reflect. But even in the Ukrainian media, you have people who are quite critical, actually. And it's in a very limited way, because obviously the country is at war, and obviously they have laws that prevent to be too critical, and this is certainly the way it is in a country that is at war. But even in the Ukrainian media, you had severe critics about the way the West was supporting the Ukraine, including, as I said before, the type of training they received from the Western armies, because they said, well, this training is not adapted to what we are witnessing every day in our on the battlefield. And in addition to that, the Ukrainians themselves have been very critical at the Western media. I mean, I've seen, I mentioned that also in my book, so that was last year, that you had Ukrainian soldiers saying, well, when we came here to the front line, we were told that the Russians were weak, that they had no ammunition, that they were poorly commanded, and that the leadership was they were basically coward, and they would flee as soon as we came. They had no equipment anymore. Our tanks were superior and all that. And they said, well, what we noticed is that when we came on the front line, it was exactly the opposite. The Russians are better equipped than us. They are better trained than us. They have more ammunition than us. They have more consistent equipment and logistics than we do, and so on and so forth. So, and that you could see in the Ukrainian media. So it's fascinating to see that even the Ukrainians themselves were very critical about the way the Western countries supported them. And in the West, we didn't take any lesson from that. We just continued based on our narrative. And in fact, we are just pushing Ukraine to the disaster.
You know, when it comes to this strategy of Putin in this war, there are many people in the West, even Russians, the far right Russians, are criticizing Putin for his strategy in this war because they believe that as long as this war is going on and on, it may bring some sort of new escalations to this war and direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. How do you find this? Do you think that's possible that at the end of the day we see some sort of direct confrontation between NATO and Russia?
Well, it is possible. I mean, the problem is that today the Western countries don't see any exit to this conflict. They are pushing new equipment, they are pushing ammunition and all that, and they see that it doesn't work. And that's why you have suddenly Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who says that we can say troops over there. But I think the European leadership is extremely irrational, I would say, in many ways. And I think, despite the fact that the US started, in fact, this conflict, and in fact, the US was instrumental in starting or setting the scene for this conflict to happen, in fact, because that's, in fact, this conflict is in their interest. To weaken Russia is in the interest of the US, not in the interest of the EU, of the European countries. And by the way, a couple of days ago, the Josep Borrell, who is the head of the European Union foreign policy, said that, in fact, Europe is fighting Russia in order to support US objectives, or US interests, US interests. So we see that there is in Europe a sense that they support US interests at large, that may include European interests as well, but the support is said explicitly US interests. So meaning that there is a sense in Europe that we have to fight this war. In the US, people start to think twice because, first of all, they have a presidential election that is coming up, and they see that they will start this election with no success at all. Basically, the Biden started its mandate with the problem of Afghanistan, and he sees that even in Gaza, the US has no leverage on Netanyahu to solve the humanitarian situation in Gaza, and that, in fact, US has lost its influence. And in Ukraine, the US was instrumental in supporting this conflict, and today they see that the conflict is getting out of their hand, and that suddenly France and Germany and Lithuania or whatever Baltic state is starting to wage their own war. So there is a sense in the US that things should be calmed down a little bit. And I have the feeling that although it's possible to have NATO armies, or would say armies of NATO countries, I should formulate it that way. You may have armies of NATO countries confronting the Russians. US wants to prevent NATO to be involved. And I think it's also important, what a lot of commentators forget, this distinction. There's a distinction between a NATO country that is involved, and you have NATO countries involved already now in Ukraine by having troops, We know that France and UK, for instance, they have personnel in Ukraine that helps even targeting of Russian targets. So they are directly involved already now. That has to be clear. So they may not have combat units, but they have units designed to help the Ukrainians to target Russian troops. And they are helping in targeting like the Scalp or Storm Shadow missiles or cruise missiles that are that have been delivered to Ukrainians. These are also managed by French and UK or British crews. So meaning that you may have NATO or NATO countries involved in that, but NATO as an organization, even if it has a presence in Ukraine, it is not involved as an organization. I think it's important to make this distinction. And, you know, in the NATO, a lot of people don't understand very well NATO. NATO is not like the EU or even the United Nations. In the United Nations, you have 195 countries that are basically equals. Some are more equal than others. These are the one of the Security Council and the P5, basically, they are a little bit more equal than others. But basically, all the countries are equal. And they have to decide collectively. In the European Union, it's different because the European Union is led by the European Commission. The European Commission is an unelected body that decide for the European Union. So basically, the European Union is an organization that is led by people who are unelected and who decide for people who are basically striving democracy. But that's another issue. In the NATO was created in 1949 in order to provide to the European countries the US nuclear umbrella. That means that in the NATO, you have a primus inter pares, which is the United States, because the United States provides the umbrella. And even if the decisions in the military council are decided unanimously, or they have to be decided unanimously, you will see that the US, in fact, is the maestro. This is the one who makes things happen or not. And this is for a simple reason that, as I said, they are the one who provide the rationale for NATO to exist. In fact, that's for that reason, the military commander of NATO will always be an American for that precise reason. If you look at Jens Stoltenberg, he's only a secretary general. He's not the director. You notice that. He cannot make decisions. He only the secretary general. That means he represents the different members of the alliance, basically the allied countries, but he cannot decide upon them, cannot make any decision. Jens Stoltenberg can say whatever he wants. This is not a decision. I mean, he can make administrative decisions, but he cannot make operational decisions. So you, as the Ursula von der Leyen, the opposite in the European Commission, she can make decision, but not Stoltenberg. It's very important to notice. The one who makes decision in the NATO, in fact, is Joe Biden. In fact, this is that. Of course, he needs to have the agreement of all the other members, but basically, if the US is not on board, nothing will happen at all. So meaning that, and you can see right now that I mentioned different terrorist attacks that were waged against Russia by probably Ukrainians, I mean, most probably Ukrainians, not probably, waged by Ukrainians, in fact, against Russia. And you can see that the US has tried to take influence and tried to make Zelensky to calm down and to stop, for instance, targeting oil refineries and all that. And you may even see that the US has tried to removed some Russian banks from the sanction list, for instance, very recently, because apparently the US understands that the situation can go very quickly out of hand, and they tried to regain some kind of control and try to calm down their European friends. And I have no crystal ball, but I can assume that the Americans will make every effort to avoid an escalation in Ukraine. Because, first of all, the NATO as an organization and as individual countries are not ready to fight Russia. We have seen the recent report that the artillery or the artillery production and missile production in Russia outpassed the whole NATO production by 3 times. So Russia has definitely a war industry that works much better. And why does it work better? It's not because the Russians are smarter. It's just because the Russian military-industrial complex is still at least partially state-owned, meaning that this is a complex that doesn't work based on profit, but based on national interest. And therefore, the only problem for the Russian government will be to find manpower to run the factories. This is the only problem. But they will not have problem to run the production lines. While on the other side, if you go on the Western side, since most of countries have a privatized military-industrial complex that works based on profit. So basically, people say, well, I don't want to create a new factory just to produce shells that will be used just for 2 months, and then you have a peace agreement, because who will pay for this new factory? That. So this is the kind of thinking that affects the European production. As a result, although we can assume that private industry is, in theory, more reactive than state-owned industries, the reality in the military-industrial complex is slightly different. Because, again, when it's based on national interests, then it's easier to step up the production, while on the West it will not be able. As a result, if the NATO as an organization, or if individual countries would start confronting Russia on the ground, maybe they can achieve some success. I don't know. This is then the law of warfare that will speak. But the strategic approach is that the Europeans are not ready for this kind of war. They don't have the potential, and they're not ready. They don't have the capacity. They may have capabilities, but they don't have the capacity of doing that. And that's the reason why I think the Americans are aware of that, and probably a little bit more realistic than the Europeans on that. And I think that the Americans will try to avoid such a conflict. We could add to this that in addition to that, you have, of course, the risk of going into a nuclear war. And that's a problem that may involve the US. So let's assume you have France or Poland, let's say, that start a war in Russia, and suddenly Russia gets the advantage and threatens Warsaw or a city in Romania, I don't know, then the Poles will ask for a nuclear missile from the US. So the US might be involved in a conflict that it didn't want in the first instance. So that's the reason why I think the US, despite all the criticism we can have against the US for having, let's say, put oil on the fire in the beginning of the conflict, and in fact have created the condition for having this conflict. But today, probably the US is probably the force that may help to not to solve, but to avoid an escalation, let's say that way.
Just to wrap up this session, I want to talk about Europe and how Europe has hurt during this conflict. And we don't see anything coming from European leaders talking about this, especially from Germany, from Italy, from France. Even Macron, he was the guy who was trying to make some sort of agreement when this conflict started. Right now, he's totally different. He has totally different manner toward this conflict, toward Russia. At the end of the day, we're gonna have some sort of negotiations to put an end to this conflict. But when it comes to Europe, how do you see the future of Europe? Because without Russia, if we take out Russia out of Europe, there would be tremendous problems for Europe in terms of energy, in terms of security. And how do you see Europe managing these problems in that region?
Well, in fact, we start that already. We see that there's, at least in Germany, Germany had a concept of, since the late 60s, by the way, Germany imports its energy from Russia. And it has done so consistently since the late 60s. And even during the Cold War, at no point in time, the Russians stopped to provide energy. And they provide cheap energy, reliable energy, and it did that. So the idea of cutting this link with Russia was in itself totally irrational. But of course, it was done. The thing is that what we can see is that the European leadership is, in fact, is a dogmatic leadership. It assumes that Russia is a dictatorship, and therefore it's right to fight a dictatorship, and period. So they don't really care about what is the cost of that. By the way, we have to understand that several sanctions, not all of them, but several sanctions, like sanctions on the oil products, sanctions on the SWIFT, this interbanking agreement that allows payment between banks, and Russia was expelled from that system in February or March 2022. For those systems, for instance, the US advised Europe not to take these sanctions. They advised them not to take sanctions on the oil market, because they would see that these sanctions would affect the whole market. And as a matter of fact, in fact, if you cannot see Europe as an isolated market. If you start cutting the supply in oil, that means that the oil have to be taken somewhere else. And as a result, you will have an impact on the supply and the demand of oil, and therefore you will have an increase in price. I mean, any student in a primary school would understand that, but not European leaders. And I remember having seen, it was in Bloomberg or so in the early, that was late 2021, when the West started to elaborate a few scenarios for sanctions. And the West discouraged or tried to discourage the US started to discourage Europeans to take sanctions on the oil market, on the oil product. So the Europeans went ahead without considering the impact. But we also have to understand that their basis for thinking was the fact that Russia had a very weak economy and that the Russia economy would collapse within days. I remind you what I just said about the French Minister of Economy, who said this is the sanctions work and Russia will collapse. So they were convinced about this. And this is exactly the kind of mistake this leadership goes into, and it cannot go backwards, because going backwards would be a recognition, an admission that you made wrong decisions. And you can make a wrong decision when you buy a pair of shoes, but when you start to making decisions that will affect your whole economy, that means that you didn't take into consideration all aspects. So then, therefore, your government basically has made a huge mistake. So nobody wants to acknowledge that. But recently, as Emmanuel Macron announced that he was ready to send troops in Ukraine, he also said at the same time that France was entering a war economy. So there is a sense, and when you see now the results, and this is a huge debate, of course, the politicians don't want to relate that to the sanctions. But the fact of the matter is that what we see today in France and Germany is a collapse which is due to the lack of the lack of competitiveness. And you see a lot of companies, German companies, for instance, are in fact relocating their production facilities to China. So that means that you have an increase in unemployment in Germany, and you have, at the same time, you have a collapse of the industrial network in Germany because of the lack of competitiveness, or the productivity is in fact no longer competitive with what you can see in other parts of the world. So they start to realize that. They start to realize that they are in a war economy, and they spend so much to support the economy. And by the way, we have also to remember that the Ukrainian crisis has come after the coronavirus crisis in Europe, where you had a lot of government support to the industry. So you have billions, hundreds of billions that have been spent in trying to support the economy during the COVID crisis. And now you have almost the same problem coming to support Ukraine. And the thing is that at the end, you have to find the money somewhere. And then you have an increase, although all the government, especially in France, they promised there wouldn't be no increase in taxes. But the fact of the matter is that at one point you need to increase your taxes because you need more money. And therefore the trust in the government is plummeting in all the countries in all Europe. And that gives a change in the sense that all those who were critical against the regimes or the governments, which is in essence the right wing and sometimes extreme right wing, tend to be supported by the population. So we are facing a very strange situation that these governments who wanted to fight the dictatorship in Russia and fight for democracy and fight for values and all that, they are in fact promoting systems that are no longer in tune with democratic values, because there is a total lack of trust into the government. So we are, and nobody wants to acknowledge, because it would be easy to acknowledge that it is the result of wrong decisions, but they don't want to acknowledge that. And I think this is probably the fate of Europe, and we'll probably see a collapse. I mean, Germany is certainly going towards a collapse. Now you have a delegation going to China with all the CEOs of Germany, meaning that there is a strong interest in Germany to have better relationship with China. But the problem is that China has been declared as an enemy by the European Union, by NATO. So we are in a situation, we put ourselves in a situation where we have enemies all around us. So it was just oversimplistic to think that we could try to make Russia collapse without provoking an improved relationship between China and Russia. I mean, how come didn't we come to this idea? We thought, and I remember having those experts on China saying, well, but China hates the Russians hate the Chinese, and they have things, the divergence, and they will never be in a sustainable agreement. And what we have seen in 2 years, exactly the opposite. So we are going from false assessments to wrong assessments, to other wrong assessments, and all that. One leads to the other. And I think if nobody tries to come back to the reality, we are in a downgoing spiral, in fact.
Thank you so much for being with us today. Great pleasure to talk with you. I think these talks are so crucial, so important for the future of Europe, for the future of here in Brazil, for the future of the world, for the future of the United States, Russia, China, all of us.
Well, I think it's even so important because your country, I mean, we haven't talked about the BRICS and all that, but in fact, this is the consequence of that conflict, that you see the importance, the growing importance of the BRICS, the growing importance of the role, not only in economic terms, but also in political terms. And we see this role, in fact, although Brazil is not directly involved, but it's still a member of the BRICS that brought the Israel case in front of the International Court of Justice, because South Africa is one of the components of the BRICS. So we see the growing importance of what some call the global South, of which the BRICS is a central piece. So there is definitely an increased role of the southern hemisphere, in fact. And at the same time, we see the decline of the northern hemisphere in all sense of the word. We have a decline in industrial production, the decline in creativity, the decline in political influence, the decline in also preserving values. Because when we talk about, and I was this morning in the European Parliament talking to a Italo-French parliamentary, and he was talking about defending values. Okay, we didn't elaborate on that because we had no time to do that. But when he talks about defending, which values are we talking about? Because the value we tend to defend are not at all those who we used to defend, and not at all those who are defended by the southern part of the globe. So we see a growing mismatch between the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And we see that the southern hemisphere grows in importance also because of its economic power and political power, meaning that it gains credibility, it gains also more trust by the rest of the world. And as a result, yes, I don't want to elaborate because I see that you probably want to end your show at one point, but we have talked about the conflict in itself and its impact on Europe and all that, but there are a huge amount of consideration we can make about the role of this conflict in the whole balance of the world. And I think this conflict, because of the mismanagement of the West, this conflict we have historical proportion, I think, much more than the conflict we may have seen in Europe, like in ex-Yugoslavia and all that, which are important in themselves, but these are conflicts that have regional dimension, if you want. The Ukrainian conflict, although it's regional in nature or in substance, it gained global importance because of the impact of the mismanagement of the West. And that's what probably needs to be addressed at one point, where I'm ready to discuss that further with you anytime. And that was a pleasure to be with you tonight.